AWS outage and how to be prepared for this type of stuff, that even the best can get into that. So if you want, I'll briefly go through the article real quick. This was from Information Week, and and this is the second time in roughly a year that AWS in the region has went down, affecting companies like I think Netflix and some others in there. It was down for roughly 7 hours. It was the Northern Virginia region, which is actually near me, which I'm kind of surprised. I don't know that I personally experienced anything when this went down, but essentially they had some capacity issues, and that's what these things are designed to do. You move a lot of your core. When it first thing started out, you put kind of secondary things. People still kept core infrastructure in house for stuff like old Exchange servers. I managed more than my fair share of internal email servers and web servers, stuff like that. Then as the cloud was starting to become its thing, granted I moved out of the hands-on pieces, but you started moving the secondary things till now it's like all core function. There's very little that people maintain internally anymore because they want the availability, which goes into that whole CIA triad thing for any of you, really in the know what that is, but the availability piece and your five nines. If you're not familiar with the five nines, it's 99.9999%. I don't know if that was five or six. But essentially that, and I have a chart because I was doing this for something else, that type of uptime means you'll only experience 5 minutes and 26 seconds, if I'm correct, of downtime per year. AWS had 7 hours of outage there. So, it's funny how, what are we supposed to do? I mean, you put that stuff there, where's the threshold where you're going, what's acceptable? How well do you know your numbers?
And I thought this was an interesting article, especially since, like it pointed out, this isn't the first time this has happened. And it happened last year, back in 2020, in November. So around the same time, it happened because of a capacity issue back then. This time, I believe it was because they had some faulty they had several failing network devices that took them down. So they had to replace these things, and so it took a little over 7 hours to do it. Cool. So taking a step back, you know. To me, this is the nature of the beast, and this, from a business level perspective, this is what we now have to account for, because moving to the cloud is still a good thing. It still does not make sense from my perspective, it doesn't make sense to have everything in local environments and everything else like that. There are advantages to the cloud. Those advantages do not disappear. But just because all these advantages exist doesn't mean that it doesn't have its detractions that we have to, once again, risk mitigate. You have to have good continuity plans, business continuity. I know that you've got IT people that are telling you about business continuity plans and why they're important. This is one of the reasons why it's important, because you need to understand, what are you going to do? Because this story is about AWS, but don't get it wrong. Amazon has their issues. Google has their issues. Microsoft definitely has their issues. I mean, none of these guys are impervious to this. So if whatever your hosting platform is, wherever you're putting up and standing up your infrastructure, wherever that's at, what happens if that is no longer available to you? And it can be something that is caused miles away from you, because once again, this took down a whole eastern region. So it wasn't just one small town that was a minor inconvenience. As I look back at the article, this impacted Athena, it impacted Chime, Netflix, and Disney Plus, in addition to all of their web services in that eastern region. So what do you do? How are you going to build against that? And this is why you should, from a C-level executive position, you should be talking with your IT people and everybody in that suite to say, okay, if this happens, what kind of a risk are we going to assume? How do we avoid? What do we do? What is going to be our response, so that while ever they're down, because you don't know how long it's going to take them to get the system back up and running. In this case, it took a little over 7 hours, but that 7 hours, if your infrastructure isn't available, what do you do? How do you run? How do you operate? Are you dead in the water?
I think this also comes into a place where you've got to know your finances. This is where having a strong relationship with the CFO, the COO, and the COO come into place, or whatever scale your business is, because you should know how much downtime costs your business. You're going to have direct and indirect costs that are related to that. So you can sit there hypothetically and go, all right, we're down for an hour. I know it cost me for hypothetically $1,000 an hour to run my business. We're down. It's costing me $1,000 that I'm not making money. On top of that is that opportunity cost that's lost during that time period of the outage as well. So then you're coming back with what's the formula where we go the pain threshold so high because we've experienced a couple of these outages now. Imagine a company like Netflix, how much is it costing them being down for 7 hours, being one of the biggest platforms on the planet, for instance, for them
Right.
to sit there and go, we need to be, we need to build another co-location, another different way of content delivery network to compensate for this because we've had these things and the numbers make sense. So I think a lot of times it's making the numbers make sense to how much you're going to invest in that. I've seen the government do that, having been in a lot of experience with the government projects where they've got a single data center that's functioning. One we are working on is a worldwide platform. But these are not public infrastructure. They're private infrastructure, private data facilities. The ones that I was personally involved with in the past. And then it's like, hey, all right, now we need that co-location environment. We can't have anything down because we're providing critical level services. So they had some thresholds because you're talking multiple tiers of people involved with that, with the government involved, of course, and us as the contracting staff, to sit there and go and identify what those thresholds needed to be. This is acceptable before we turn our warm site, the site that's prepped and ready to go, into the hot live site. As kind of the failover. So I think it does really come back to you've got to know the impact of what you're doing at a company level. You need to know your finances to understand how much it's costing you, not only in direct costs, but also the lost opportunity, particularly when in their case with failed devices, you hope somebody like AWS has a whole pile of extra stuff building around, or if it's networking devices, that they've got different ways to route stuff around to get things back up quick. But in the off cases, that super, super rear random thing that goes down, you got your fingers crossed a little bit. It's not too bad.
Well, and I think in AWS's case, I mean, obviously they had equipment. Otherwise, the outage would have lasted longer than 7 hours, and so
Absolutely.
they were able to get around it and navigate through that. But from a small business perspective, what does that look like for you? How quickly can you navigate around that? What is your incident response plan? How quickly can you put action against it? You should know. Going back to your point, you should know your numbers. That's what I tell people all the time. You should know your numbers. What does an hour of downtime cost you? Because if you don't think that the Fortune 500 companies know that, they know how much a second costs them. They got it down that far. And so you need to know what's an hour of downtime cost you from an executive standpoint so that you can then put value to remediation or mitigation. All right, well, if an hour of downtime costs me X amount of millions of dollars, then I'm going to allocate, a half a million or whatever that budgetary number is to make sure that we're in a position where we can avoid that at all costs, or whatever that number is. But you should be having those conversations, and I think that's the reason why I wanted to have bring this topic up or this article up, so we can have this conversation to get our executives out there thinking in a different perspective, because they think of cybersecurity, they think of IT as just a tool, a resource, and a cost item on their balance sheet, where in all actuality, an ounce of prevention is worth way more than what it's going to cost you to actually remediate and fix the issue. And so that's one of the things that I think this article points that out, because we're putting all of our eggs in one basket as we're moving to the cloud. And does it make sense to have redundant cloud systems? Most times, no. But you should understand, okay, this is the risk that I'm assuming. I'm a big believer in, we're going to assume some risk as business leaders. It's what we do, because you can't mitigate every risk and avoid every single one of them. It's impossible. If you try to do that, you'd never be in business.
You
So
won't
I
be.
think that you're going to assume some, but assume it knowingly, not blindly. That's my big thing. That's my big argument, is that anytime that just because you don't do something, okay, that doesn't mean that the risk doesn't still exist. You're assuming that risk, you just unknowingly assumed it. So I prefer not to walk blindly. Let's be educated on what's going out there. Let's not put our heads in the sands and say, hey, these threats don't impact me. They only impact big people. No, because whenever it does bite you, it's going to bite you 10 times harder, and the chances are, you might not be able to recover from it. And so that's why I wanted to bring up these conversations. Is why I think articles like this, they help paint that picture and just give us a different perspective on things.
No, and I think that's a good way to kind of put a pin on this first episode of the C Word podcast. With the takeaway is, don't assume risk blindly. Have your eyes open. Take time to build that review process in, whether that's per project, per department, on some sort of cadence, some sort of schedule. So definitely, and I'm going to use one of my points just to make fun. Just know your numbers. Know your numbers.